Welcome to our weekly book club episode here at Homeschool Moms Unfiltered. I'm your host, Megan, and my amazing co-host is...
Hi, I'm Amanda.
All right, do not let the term book club throw you off. There was no homework assignment due in order to tune in and listen to this episode, we promise. And to take the pressure down another notch, we are a pretty slow-moving book club right now.
This is so true. When we approve join requests for our Facebook community, we look at all of the other groups that people belong to. Side note, we vet memberships really hardcore to keep our group a kind, safe, secular, and progressive space. But in any event, I always see these people. There are a lot of members of this group called the Slow AF Running Club. It's not for me. Okay. I only run if there's like a bear chasing me. And even then, I'm better off just laying down and playing dead. But that feels very fitting for our book club right now.
You're not lying. We are reading Deborah Reber's book, Differently Wired, and there's just so much good content that we are only making it through one to, if we're lucky, 2 chapters each week. And it's not a complaint, not at all. I mean, it's an amazing book. It's just what it is. We're just very slow moving right now. So you're welcome to read along with us. It is an awesome book. But if you're like, my plate is overflowing and now you're giving me a freaking reading assignment to listen to a podcast, no, that is not what is happening here. Do not stress. You can absolutely tune in, listen to our Sparks Notes style digest of the book. Or if you're the same age as Amanda and I, you call them Cliff Notes, but nowadays the youngsters call them Spark Notes. So we're being hip here. So you can listen while you're prepping dinner, folding laundry, driving to pick up your kids, whatever works. And you never once have to touch the book if that's not your jam. So do not feel any pressure.
Yeah, totally. So Differently Wired is all about neurodivergence. And if you're not parenting a neurodiverse kiddo, you might be thinking like, I don't really need to stick around for this. But I do really recommend parents of neurotypical kids listen as well for a few different reasons. We're a progressive podcast. We're a progressive community, and we fully support DEI initiatives. Okay, if we're going to support it, we need to better understand it. It is essential for neurotypical kids and the parents or caregivers of those kids to understand how neurodiverse kids tick in order to be able to create a more empathetic and inclusive world, whether we're trying to help our kids have an enjoyable play date or we're trying to be the understanding parental figure overseeing the play date. We need to understand. And in fact, today we're going to be sharing some stats about neurodiverse adults in the workplace that might really kind of blow your mind. And the reality is the neurotypical kids of today will someday be managers. They're going to work in HR. They're going to help hire employees. They're going to interview. And I think it's really important to level the playing field. So important to understand these general ideas and concepts and just have a really solid foundation there.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree. So let's dive in because as usual, we have way too many notes. And as such, today, our only goal is to get through chapter 3 in a timely manner. So chapter 3 is square pegs in round holes. Do you want to kick us off, Amanda?
Sure. So I thought it was interesting. She opens up with this kind of analogy where she's talking about how people, when they run a marathon, I have no idea because, again, not a runner. But she talks about how around miles like 18 to 20, your body kind of hits a wall. I have been to support enough friends who are running marathons, and I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. And she talks about how something similar happens to parents of differently wired kiddos at some point in their journey. And for me, I was just like, I think that's a good analogy. I think it's probably very true. And I think that we probably all hit that point, some earlier and some later. But it's just that point, right, where we're freaking tired of the fight. And we throw our hands up and we bury our heads in a book or a new TV series. We sit on the couch and we eat chocolate or chips and dip, like whatever is your thing. And we're just like, I can't. Like, I can't. I'm No more emails, no more arguing, no more fight. I like, fine, whatever. I'm done. And then, nearly all of us get back to it, right? Like, just like marathon runners as well. Like, if you're going to keep the analogy going, most of them dig deep and they do their best, even if they have to walk for a while. Even the ones who walk a good chunk, you see them at the very end pushing to actually run across the finish line. I feel like it's a pretty accurate analogy all the way through for parenting, and not the struggles that you have with your neurodiverse children so much as the struggles you have fighting for your neurodiverse children in a world that doesn't necessarily want them to fit in.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. I made a note on the next page. Now, some of the notes that I made for this week, I kind of read through the lens of knowing that there are plenty of people in our community who are on the fence about homeschooling. And we've talked about this in other episodes where it's like they're so close. They're so there, but it's scary. I get it, right? I mean, it is really scary to leave the system that is the prescribed system that we're told is the one and only way kids will be successful in life, that your family is constantly telling you that you're going to screw it up, that you're not enough, all this kind of stuff. So we get it. But I know there are plenty of people who are like, school is not working and they're holding on. They're white knuckling it. They're really holding on. And so I made some notes today, knowing that probably some of those people are listening as well. And so on the next page, there was a note here. There's a whole engagement here where a mom is saying that her son comes home from school and says that the kids at school are killing his dream. And she says to her husband, when are we going to listen to our son? He's telling us that this is not working. When are we going to listen? And I just wanted to add to that. And I think we've talked about it before, way back in other episodes, that sometimes they're not going to tell you verbally, but they're going to tell you that they have headaches all the time, that they feel nauseous all the time. You're going to get calls from the school nurse that your kid is in the nurse's office all the time. And I've seen stuff where parents are so dismissive of that, not necessarily in circles we travel in, because it's just typically not the kind of parents that we interact with. But sometimes you see, like, you notice how they only ever have a headache on a school day. And it's like, yeah, because school is the thing that's causing the headache. It's stress or it's anxiety or it's the lighting in the classroom or it's the noise in the classroom or whatever it is. They're telling you something. So they might not necessarily verbally tell you that something's not working, but you can see it in your kids. You know it. So I get that it's scary. If you need somebody to help you take the plunge, come talk to us. But it's a plunge well worth it from two people who've done it. So, no bias here. Okay, then I had another note on 43, and I'm a Kindle reader for this book. So if my page numbers are off and you're reading along with us, please forgive me. But it's 43 for me. It says, those of us raising differently wired kids are engaged in a more extreme form of child rearing. And I was like, yes, so much so, right? I feel that completely. And then also she goes on a little bit later where she talks about the fact, she says it's a huge problem in disability circles. Parents talk to each other, but not to adults who share their children's disabilities. And that really does promote stigma and misunderstanding and all of the other stuff that we need to get rid of. And I think this happens a lot in the autistic discussions that I see, where people are like, what about ABA? And almost all the time, the response to ABA is talk to adults, talk to autistic adults, see what their thoughts are. Because a lot of times it's very well-meaning medical personnel that are giving you their thoughts and their feedback, but they're not the person who has the thing. So it would be kind of like asking somebody who's not visually impaired what it's like to be visually impaired or how to help a visually impaired person. If you want to know how to help a visually impaired person and set up a space that's going to accommodate them, go ask a visually impaired person what they need in order to succeed. And so it's kind of the same concept. I'm in a lot of autism groups, right? And there was one that got started locally when I was living in South Carolina. And there was a parent who posted, she was at a crossroads about something. And I said, why don't you ask some autistic adults? And she replied back and was like, I wouldn't even know where to start. How would I do that? We need to figure this out. You can join Facebook groups for autistic individuals. I would even go, we had a really big community group in town that had like 40,000 members in it. I would even just post in there and say, hey, I'm at a parenting crossroads and I would really appreciate talking to some adults who are autistic. Would anybody mind DMing me? Out of 40,000 people in that group, there are autistic adults. And I guarantee you some of them will message you and be more than willing to chat and help. So ask, right? Ask the people who are adults who are in the real world, who are doing that thing, and get some advice from them, because I totally agree that it continues stigma and misunderstanding. I've seen it again and again and again.
Okay, so for me, the thing that I thought was most interesting about this chapter is it's broken down into these different kind of topics. And so page 44 starts a new topic called isolation and stigma. So it's nothing, I didn't personally find a lot of things in here that I felt like I really needed to pull out. She's just kind of pointing out this idea that when your kiddo has any kind of neurodivergence and you're having this different parenting journal, you can really find both your kiddo and yourself kind of isolated and these stigmas from the outside world. And it's that idea of like, we've talked about it before. If you have a gifted kiddo, you can be the asshole who's like, I've got a gifted kiddo. And everyone's like, actually, you probably don't if you're that excited and happy to tell everyone about it. And if you have an actual gifted kiddo with all of the amazing things that come along with it, it's hard to say that to people and it's hard to have that conversation. And it's hard to find people who are in the same boat that are thinking the same way as you and that are going to address it the same way and that are having the same challenges or struggles and how they're addressing, like it's hard to find your people no matter what. And then when you're narrowing the group down and you've got really specific criteria and you're trying to find someone who thinks the same way you do and has the same values and the same parenting ideas, and you're picking from a much smaller group of parents or caregivers, it gets really hard to find a community of people that are all like-minded about this thing. And so whether we're trying really hard to find community or we're just like, oh, I can't put myself out there on this, or I feel like I can't talk about my kid, because I know a lot of people when they first start the process of diagnosis feel like they can't share that. It's not their place, or they don't want to openly talk about it, again, because of the stigma being put on by society and all of that jazz. Whether we do it on purpose or it's completely inadvertently, we isolate ourselves quite a bit. And again, that idea, yes, it's hard for the kids, but it's also hard for the parents because, like we need community as well. And I feel like when things are hard is when you extra need community, but when it's extra hard to go out and get it, right? Extra hard to go out and develop it. So I thought it was a good point.
So it was interesting because I highlighted the same section before I had read your notes. And I specifically highlighted this section here that says many of us experience the same sense of isolation, fear of judgment from others, and not knowing where we fit into our schools, neighborhoods, and communities. And as a result, we feel left out of the party, cut off from the cool parenting club. And I think it's that last part. I don't think I have felt that way. But at the same time, I've been homeschooling for so long. And I think that in general, in the world of homeschooling, there is a little bit more acceptance towards neurodivergence, quirkiness, a blend of everything, more so probably than in traditional education circles. But then part of me was also just kind of like, am I oblivious to the fact that I've been left out of the cool parenting club? Like maybe that's it, right? Like maybe I have been this whole time and it just didn't bother me. I don't know. So it was interesting because what you said makes way more sense.
Well, yeah. And I think for me, it resonated on a couple levels. The quote that you just read, the first part made me think of how many times have I been in the grocery store and there's a mom there with a kid who's having that grocery store meltdown. And there are all of these people who are judging her hardcore. And you hear the people who are like, why doesn't she just have better control of her kid? Like, she needs to take him outside and straighten him out or whatever. Or even the more well-intentioned who are just like, wow, what's going on there? And I'm thinking, what's going on there? That's a kid who either is neurodiverse and having some real sensory overload issues, or it's a kid with major trauma, also having sensory overload issues. And I want to go up and be like, you're doing fine. You're doing a great job. I know it doesn't feel like it right in this moment, but you're doing a great job. But I would guess that it's a really small percentage of people who have that feeling. And so for me, that's that stigma part.
Makes sense.
Because she's feeling awful about herself and she knows that all of those people around her are saying awful things about herself. And she's going to internalize that. Kind of like in earlier this week in our podcast, we talked about how it doesn't matter if we know it's not true. When we hear those things when they're happening around us, we internalize whether we shouldn't a lot of times. And then the cool mom club part of it, I didn't necessarily feel that. But I have a couple of friends, and even beyond that, I do know that when we were foster parents, we had one foster love in particular who was a big biter and a hitter. And it definitely got to a point where we weren't necessarily welcome at some of the play dates that we had been going to on a regular basis. And they knew that we were foster loves and they were all supposed to be progressive and inclusive. But at the end of the day, they didn't want their kiddo bit. And I mean, it's that hard thing. Like, I understand that if it was my kiddo who was someone's chew toy, I wouldn't be particularly gung-ho about that either. But there's, so that like, when you remove you remove yourself from the situation to protect your kid, but then you are on the outside of that group.
Mm-hmm. So I think that thought leads me to the next note that I have, which is on page 45 for me. And she talks about when you can't find your people in real life, you can find them online. You join these very specific niche-based groups. And so she talks about here sharing information and all of that and crying tears of gratitude for the virtual hugs and words of support that come streaming in. And so I just wanted to share, for me, 100% yes, right? I remember it was probably 2 years ago, maybe even a little bit more, that I had just reached a point where my sole function was keeping one of my kids on the rails. And it was all me, and neither one of us were sleeping. And it was exhausting, and it could only be me all the time. And so I just didn't know what to do at that point, because not only was it the moment that was very difficult, but then looking forward and thinking, how does this evolve? How do we ever reach a point where this works in the long term? And I went into one of the Facebook groups that I'm in, and I set up an event in Facebook like you can do. And I just put it out there, and I was like, anybody who is parenting a kid with ADHD specifically, if you're willing to come and just talk, like, I just need help. I just need help. And we had this meeting, and multiple people showed up, people who parented ADHD kids, people who were ADHD themselves. And it was that one session in Zoom was completely life-changing. And some of these people, I knew their names from the Facebook group, but we never talked. We're not friends afterwards. Like, it was literally just a one-time coming together. And I made some really big decisions based upon that. I totally cried through the meeting. But these people that came together and just said, here's what I think, here's the experience that I've had, here's what might work, here's an idea for you. Life-changing, absolutely life-changing. And after that, we made some decisions that drastically changed things. So don't be afraid to go into those groups and just say, hey, I mean, I would say that even about our group. If you want to set up a thing where you're like, I'm homeschooling a kid who's XYZ and I don't know I am at the end of my rope. Will anybody come and talk to me? Come, let's do it. It doesn't have to necessarily be just Amanda and I. You can put out an open call to parents and say, can you help me? Because people get it. The people who are going through the same thing get it. And they showed up and they helped me.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, it kind of perfectly sums up this chapter, this section of the chapter on page 46 at the end. She says, the struggle, as they say, is real, and it's hurting us emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And I think there's a lot of strength and power in admitting when something is hard and when it's hurting us emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, because you have to be really brave to admit when you're failing, when things aren't going the way that you need them to go. And it's not that you're failing so much as if you are being hurt emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, you're failing yourself. And you need to do something. You deserve better. And you can't get to better. You can't work on better until you admit that you need to. That was the point for me that it kind of drove home. Mm-hmm. All right. So I was going to say, I'm happier knows, but I'm not really sure. But next section,
it doesn't happier.
It doesn't. Useful maybe, but not happier. So the next section is called behavioral challenges. And this section talks about anger and emotional outbursts and how sometimes those emotional outbursts also lead to violence with little kids or bigger kids and just the struggle with all of that. And generally, I thought it was pretty good. I was reading and I was like, okay, yeah, I'm picking up what she's putting down. There was one thing that I thought she really kind of downplayed that I was like, I don't know how I feel about that. And that was, she was talking about how when kids are overwhelmed or upset, especially for neurodiverse kids, a lot of times there's one of two reactions. They either become emotionally overwhelmed and they start crying, or they become emotionally overwhelmed and they have like an outburst. And she was like, well, the crying is acceptable and the outburst isn't. And I think that there's some truth to that, right? I mean, as a society, we have real big feelings about violence and how that plays into morality and all of that jazz. And that's becoming, I think, again, a bigger issue in society as a whole with the dumpster fire that is our society right now. But I also think that crying is becoming a bigger issue with the dumpster fire that is our society right now. And it seems like there's a growing pushback on this whole crying being okay for boys because of the far right and their bizarre obsession with gender and gender roles and toxic masculinity and just all of that grossness. And so I do think that we need to be aware of it and handle it. I don't know the right way to put it, right? But it is an issue. It's becoming more of an issue again, I feel like. And yeah, especially as kids get older, being there and being a support for them and understanding that it is still a behavioral challenge and that it needs to be handled a little differently.
Yeah. And I agree with you that it's becoming more of an issue. I mean, we lived in the South and the number of fuck your feelings t-shirts and bumper stickers and all that. And I'm just like, why? What is that doing for our society that you think is so amazing that no, people don't care about your feelings? Okay, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then, like fuck your feelings on one side. No, what would Jesus do on the other side? And I'm like, well, Jesus would give a shit about your feelings is all I'm saying. I'm not a Christian, but I'm just saying, I feel like your bumper stickers are out of sync. Okay.
I mean, there might be a reason you're losing a lot of people, and it's this kind of bumper sticker messaging.
Specifically.
Yeah. All right. So moving on page 48, it was talking about some real life examples of kids not having the focus to follow through on things. They were discussing like getting distracted easily. One person was like, oh, my kiddo can get distracted walking down the stairs. Someone else was like, oh, like how frustrating is it that they finish their homework, but then they don't turn it in? And there's a quote. She says, these are perplexing behaviors. And unfortunately, the strategies our friends with neurotypical kids use are inadequate for us. Parents of typical kids might threaten to take away an iPad to secure compliance or guide a child through the logical process of understanding how their behavior negatively affects others. But punishments are essentially penalizing a differently wired child for being who they are, and logical conversations that don't address what's at the root of the child's behavior won't yield results. And it's one of those things, I feel like I say this pretty often, I'm of two minds. Generally, I'm a big believer in discussion when things happen. This idea, like the difference between consequence and punishment, I think there's a pretty big difference between that. And I like natural consequences in general far more than I like arbitrary consequences and definitely arbitrary punishments. But I do see this sort of stuff way too often in parenting groups where parents, they aren't taking into consideration that their children are differently wired. And then they have these punishments that are just like super unnecessarily harsh. Of like, how would you feel if someone took something that's totally normal for you and was like, that is not okay. And I'm taking away your car keys for 2 weeks. So even though you're a grown up, and that has nothing to do with the fact that you burn dinner for the third night in a row.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked before, we talked about it in a parenting episode back in episode or season 1, where we talked about the fact that generally I like to do kind of comparison sentences where when I'm thinking about how I would treat my kids, I'm like, would I speak to my adult neighbor that way? Would I speak to a coworker that way? Would I incentivize an adult that way to get work done, like in the workplace? Would that be appropriate? And sometimes, of course, there's like a little translation for the fact that they're kids, but generally speaking, I treat them with the same level of respect that way. And so I tend to do the same thing when it comes to neurodivergence. And so it's the same thing, like, would you get upset with, I used the analogy before about like visual impairment. Would you get upset with a child who had a clear diagnosis of medical visual impairment for breaking a glass while doing something or tripping over something and knocking it over and it breaks? Would you punish them for that? No, because they can't, there's a physical difference that's making it difficult for them. The same thing in my mind. And so having those analogies where I kind of compare neurodivergence to other medical conditions that are more widely recognized or accepted in some cases really helps kind of even that out for me sometimes if you're in a moment where you're like so frustrated. Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. And we're talking about parenting. It's one of those things. Sometimes you're going to really mess it up. And it's okay. You know, you're a parent. You're going to mess it up. I like to joke, like I've got a therapy fund for whatever I've messed up and then like a college fund. But, you know, you can always try to do better and always come back and have the conversation that you wanted to have, even if it's a little late and it requires can we do a do-over there?
Yep.
All right. So the next section was called, well, it's on page 49 and it's called Strain on the Family. First, she kind of talks about this idea, like if you have multiple children and the concerns about trying to protect sibling relationships or siblings feeling shortchanged because they always had to accommodate another sibling, whether that's true or not, right? Because sibling dynamics can be really complicated. Like you show me a sister who felt she always got it worse than her brother, and I bet you I can show you a brother who swears his sister got it better than he did, right? Like sibling dynamics are complicated. Then the second way she talks about with parenting partners, right? So I think this is true for lots of caregivers, that thing where like either you're just totally tapped out, or whether it's touched out or mentally exhausted from managing some big meltdown or whatever happened, and you just have nothing left for your partner at the end of the day. You're there. I got nothing for you. Like I'm gonna go hibernate and try to prepare for tomorrow, because tomorrow, no guarantee it's gonna be better, and I need all of my energy, and I can't do you right now in any way, shape, or form. I'm not doing you.
Well, I feel like too, it can be that, and then also resentment towards that person that they're not helping the way you're hoping that they'll help, or they're not understanding the circumstance accurately. I mean, how many times do we see people talk about the fact that they see these meltdowns as sensory issues or whatever the case might be, and their partner just sees it as this kid is unruly and needs more discipline. And so I feel like too, that can create strain where you're not even on the same page. In my household, I've explained to my husband 7,452 times that if you are going to tell kiddo number 3 that something's happening later today, you have to say, we should be able to go around 4. I have a couple of phone calls, so if it's not 4 o'clock, it'll be just after. And after telling him that many times, he'll still say, we're going at 4. And by 4:01, kiddo's already starting a meltdown because you said 4. And I'm like, I can't explain to you anymore that you can't do that. And I don't understand why you can't realize that you can't do that. And so it builds up issues where it's like, oh my gosh, because guess who gets to step in and fix the meltdown when it happens? Oh, that'd be me. Thank you very much. You fucking tell the kid it'll be sometime after 4, and none of it's happening, right? But no, we don't do that. So anyway.
Well, yeah. And the problem with that is that it's a cycle, right? Because the kid will expect their safety net parent or caregiver, the one that's most often there and most likely to understand, to be able to be the one to help them through that situation, right? To help them through the meltdown, to help them get back on track. And so then, of course, the safety net caregiver parent is going to be there and do that. But then that means that the next time this happens, the other person or one of the other people in your family, you know, they feel like, well, I can't handle it. I need the safety net parent to come in and take care of it. And so then the safety net caregiver comes in and they handle the situation, they get things back on track. And then the kid now, like, and it's just this like never ending cycle that just perpetuates itself more and more, and it becomes more deeply ingrained, which then again feeds into that, like, just so many complicated feelings for the parental units in that situation, whatever kind of grown up is doing the parenting there.
Yeah. I mean, we just had that. I was just getting ready to buy tickets for a Formula One event. And my husband was like, oh, are you coming? I mean, I enjoy Formula One, but it's not my jam. It's not like him and my boys and stuff like that. And I was like, I'm going to send this kiddo with you to an environment that's loud and crowded and hot and not be there. I'm like, I'm not going for the Formula One event, pal. The ticket is for the kiddo, is to be there to pick up the pieces. And in reality, not even get to the point where there's pieces to be picked up because I can sense it before it happens. And
try to make sure it's actually an enjoyable event for everyone involved.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so I'm like, that's why I'm going to Formula One, but I'll be there. Yes.
Yeah, no, it's true. There's a real struggle there with like, well, you want to make memories. And as the safety net parent, I can come along and help make sure they're good memories. Or I can take some time for myself and enjoy self-care. And you'll have bad memories to work with, which is not what you want. But it just puts you in a really challenging position. And I'm sure it also makes the other caregiver also feel pretty shitty about the general situation of like, oh, well, they don't trust me, or all of these kind of feelings, when in reality, you're just trying to make sure that it's good for everyone. And just because you can foresee the writing on the wall and they can't foresee the writing on the wall doesn't change the writing on the wall. No. Okay, so in this section, the kind of third way that she defines this is this idea that extended family can often be a bit judgmental and offer more judgment than help, even when it's well-intentioned. And that means that in these early days, especially, we're avoiding them at a time when we really need a village to help with this whole parenting thing. And I think that's most everyone who has a neurodiverse kid has experienced this in some way or another with some family member. And if you've only experienced it once, you're insanely fortunate.
Yeah.
You're a unicorn. Congratulations.
I have absolutely had, I remember a visit in particular, and what it takes to get my kiddo to eat is no small thing. And when you have a kiddo with ARFID, which is food restriction, there isn't the option to be like, eventually they'll get hungry enough to eat. They will starve, right? They will not eat. And so, yes, you do have to do back handstands to get your kid to eat and make sure that the stars are all aligned and the brand is perfect and the temperature is right and the texture is right and all that kind of stuff. And I so clearly remember being like, if you would stop doing all that, he'll eat. And I'm like, no, he fucking won't. So, do you know how much food therapy we've done? Do you know how much of it? No, he won't. And that judgment is there. And I'm just like, oh, it's so hard. It totally is. I get it. All right. So we have plenty more to discuss, but also wanted to extend an invitation to our Patreon. So first of all, we just appreciate the support. We put so much time and energy into our podcast, and it actually does cost us stuff to host our podcast and all that kind of stuff. So we just appreciate the support. If you appreciate our content, we definitely appreciate a little thank you, kind of like podcast busting. And also, I think there's kind of this trend right now where, I mean, we're seeing media censorship in the United States and stuff like that. If there are people that are putting out content that you're appreciating, geez, do we have to support that right now? Because the crackdown is happening, right? It's not good. So we offer different levels of support, everything from just a $5 a month, like, thanks for the podcast. I learned a lot. It's awesome. You two are fun, whatever the case might be. all the way up to options that include getting unit studies every month and live meetings where we have social gatherings and we offer homeschool support through various Q&A functions. And when I say unit study, the really cool thing about our unit studies is you don't have to pick around the Jesus. It's all secular, progressive, inclusive. We focus on own voiced content. It is such a breath of fresh air in the homeschooling world. If I have one more freaking person tell me, but the Bible study on Mia Academy is an elective, so you can just skip it. I'm like, no, I'm tired of having to pick around the Jesus. No. So check our show notes. There's a link if you want to come hang out at our Patreon. Come on over. We'll put a discount code there as well. At least at this time, if you listen to this episode like 3 years from now, it might not still be valid. But if you're current, there's a discount code there. And hey, if you listen to this episode when it launches, which we always get like a big spike when it launches, our grown-up gathering, which is our social gathering, is next week. So come join us. Come hang out with us. We'd love to meet you. All right. So back to book club. We're doing pretty good this week, chugging along. I mean, granted, we've only got one chapter to cover because we set our limitations well, but we're doing pretty good.
No, right. And it was like mid-reading this chapter, and I sent Meagan a message and was like, we're really only going to cover one chapter this week. There's no way we're going to get the 2 in that we were hoping. So the next section is called Lack of Choice. I'm going to be honest, this first page on page 51, Lack of Choice, has like all the comments for me. I was like, oh my gosh, okay. So she has a quote that says, quote, "One of our primary jobs as parents is making choices about everything from diet and clothing to schooling and beyond." And then it kind of goes on, but it picked up with, because most every child-related decision parents raising differently wired kids make requires just a little more consideration. And for me, I was like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, clothing becomes, does it have tags in it? Can I easily cut them out without it being obvious? Are the seams finished well? Is it 100% cotton? Are the pants loose enough, but then they still stay up without the funky buttons on the extra fabric on the inside? Or how do you find the exact same pair of slip-on shoes when they move from one section of the store up to the next section of the store? And why do they always decide that they won't wear anything except X once X is sold out everywhere? Or how do I get enough nutrients into them when they won't eat meat or when they only eat white foods? Like, the list just goes on and on.
So it's funny because when I saw your notes on this section, I read the same book you did, and most of that stuff didn't even occur to me because it's become so second nature in so many cases that I'd forget that this isn't how everyone lives their lives, right? I mean, and so when I saw your notes, I was like, oh yeah, that is a thing. Like, I just bought a blanket the other day for my kiddos and had to go into the Fiverr content and check all the stuff. Oh yeah, not everyone lives this way. Shocking information.
Yeah.
And I liked it. She had this moment in here where she said, like, it took her a while to realize, the author, it didn't occur to me that I couldn't just send my kid off to camp, that she had to call and talk about their ability to navigate some of his challenges and certain things that she knows are triggers for him, and find out if those exist there and how they might be able to circumvent some of that stuff and all of that. And I was just like, oh my gosh. And so, yes, on the one hand, I'm saying some of this has become so second nature that I don't even think about it. And then on the other hand, sometimes, even though I've been living this way for so long, I still drop the ball. And you'd think that it would just be intuitive at this point. So I have a kiddo who's going on a trip. He leaves in a few days, and according to the packing list, it said lightweight trail shoes. Okay. I went online. I ordered lightweight trail shoes. I ordered them in a variety of sizes so you could try them on, return to the ones that didn't fit. No problem. They tie. And I was like, oh, like, where's my brain? Where is my brain? I know this. So thankfully, I posted in our Facebook group that we host, was like, people who are good with adaptive accommodation. I need a recommendation for shoelaces that stay put, like the kind where you replace the tying shoelace with the other. We did it. It's all good. We've practiced. They passed the test. But it's like, even sometimes when you're thinking, oh, I'm so in tune with this and this is just how I operate, you still drop the ball sometimes. And you're like, how did I not foresee this challenge?
How did I miss that? Like, how did I? Yeah, no, totally. And so that's it. Like, this whole page for me, I thought there were a lot of things that were like, oh, this is good. So the next one she pulled up was, so there's a quote again. She says, circumstances such as financial constraints or a child's plummeting emotional and mental health because of poor school fit, lead many families down the road of homeschooling, frequently as a last-ditch effort to cobble together a solution the family can live with. And I was like, well, if that doesn't apply to Homeschool Moms Unfiltered and probably 3/4 of the people in our Facebook group, I don't know what does. And she'll get into that more later. And we'll talk about that more, I'm sure. But I was just like, that one sentence, I was like, oh my gosh, yes, check. Quick. And then after that, she goes into what you were just talking about, like more specifics with the extracurriculars. So the quote says, extracurricular activities present similar challenges. Depending on what's going on with your child, say they're super sensitive, or they fall apart if things don't go their way, or their poor social skills make team sports a disaster. We can't just sign them up for an athletic or enrichment activity and assume things will be fine. Unfortunately, this reality is often a lesson we learn painfully over time as the negative experiences for our kid and our family add up. It was just like, we are lucky that that hasn't happened a lot in our family, but it did totally remind me of our foray into soccer. So my kiddo was kind of naturally pretty good. And I have a niece who played club soccer at a really high level into university. So her family was always like, oh, he's got a really strong kick. He's got this, he's got that. You've got to do something with it. And he would sometimes play with my niece who was quite a bit older than him. So we're like, okay, fine, we'll try a class. And we picked one that was a bit smaller and not like the big like soccer shots or whatever that's out there. And it had no games. It was just more like a clinic, learn the basic skills, see how it goes sort of thing. But so he was a toddler, maybe 3, might have been 4. At one point, the coach wanted everyone to sit down on the grass. And that was not going to happen. Kiddo was not sitting on the grass. But the coach would not move on until he was sitting. So eventually, Winston, my kiddo, problem solved and sat down on his own little soccer ball because each kid had to have their personal soccer ball. And
I love that he problem solved. Good for him.
Yeah, right. We were sitting quite far away. It was one of those things. It was only 45 minutes or something. So most of the parents were there and keeping an eye, but we were not actually part of the lesson. And so I'm watching, I'm like, I was pretty proud of him. Like, that's a pretty good solution to come up with when the coach is adamant you have to sit down and your butt in your shorts is not touching the ground with grass. But it was not sufficient. The coach was still not having it. And in the middle of this class, it becomes this huge power struggle. And also, not surprisingly, the end of our foray into soccer. But it's that thing when you have these moments and when someone else outside is like, no, it has to be this way. And it didn't need to end that way. It didn't need to be a big, why won't you put your butt on the grass? It just didn't. And but that's what it became. And it ruined something that could have been fun. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I'm not sad that I don't have to go to soccer every weekend. I don't really want to be a sports mom, but it just didn't have to end that way.
Do you know, I told my 3rd kid that they didn't have soccer when he was little because he asked about it. And we lived in Miami. Do you know how much soccer is in Miami? I'm married to a South American. Hello. And he was like, I think I would like to try that. I had friends and family who did the soccer mom thing. No, it takes over your entire life. It was not a thing that I'm like, no. And so I was like, I don't think they have it this session. Just have to not drive past the soccer fields on the way to the library. We have to go the other way. No. And it's 7,000 degrees outside and I'm as white as a sheet of paper and covered in freckles. And I'm not sitting on the bleachers and getting skin cancer. Will you kick a ball? It's not happening. And so no, didn't happen. He found other hobbies. They're great. And they're indoors. Mother of the year.
All right. So that brings us to the next section. The next section is on page 53 and it's called financial strain. And I will say we are planning on doing an entire episode on the realities of homeschooling and the privilege that is very often involved. But this book points out that financial strain is real. It's real. It's true from one parent working fewer or no hours to sometimes having to pay for a babysitter or a mother's helper to be able to come in and make homeschooling work while you're also working a full-time job that actually keeps your health insurance or helps take your bills or whatever that may look like. And then there's paying for all of the therapies, whether it's OT or it's actual mental health therapy and counseling. Our insurance covers it. It still costs a silly amount of money every month with insurance coverage. I mean, like these things. And then don't even get me started on all the adaptive things. If you need special clothing or you need special toys or special tools, the money, it's just a never ending cost. And, when you're doing it all yourself, it's hard.
Mhm.
That doesn't even touch the issue of how very expensive it can be to get a diagnosis.
Mhm.
And the fact that in the United States and in some other countries, because I've talked to a couple of friends who live in other countries, insurance doesn't always cover it, often because it's considered educational and not medical. And well, anything that's educational wouldn't need to be covered by, whatever. It's ridiculous. I won't get on that soapbox today, but I know in my own family, I often say that we were fortunate because we were able to plan ahead over 2 calendar years to put money aside in our HSA account that we used to pay for the cost of diagnosis, which was in the thousands, right? In the book, she mentions it costing $2,000. And I was kind of like, I don't know anyone who's only paid $2,000. Like, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
Because insurance, it's like, it just doesn't cover it a lot of the times. And
Mhm.
especially in the US, I really worry that that's going to become an even bigger issue with things that are happening in that dumpster fire that we've been talking about here lately.
Mhm. I added a note to your point, even if the insurance covers it, yes, it's still expensive, but also just the amount of time and energy that it takes to fight your insurance company, to get bills paid, to get things covered. Holy cow, it is exhausting and so stressful. Just so stressful to get looped around and sent around and around with them. I mean, I've talked about it before. I literally came to a point where I emailed the CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield. I was like, I'm done. I was done. But that was after a week of me being given the runaround. I cried so much that week that my eyes were blurry. Even when I wasn't crying, they were just like, not okay. I don't know the physiologic effect of what happened, but even when I wasn't crying, my vision was blurry because I cried so much that week. And so they have this power to do that. And I think part of the hope is that you will give up and just move on because it's so frustrating. So, okay. On 54, she mentions an article from The Atlantic in 2016, The Atlantic magazine, called The Special Education Charade. And we'll link it in our notes below. And we've also got it scheduled to go out in our Facebook group. But we've also, it could be behind a paywall. If you've looked at other stuff on The Atlantic, it's one of those things where you only get like 2 free clicks a month or something. So we'll also include some just kind of a description, a little synopsis for you. But basically, it talks about the inequities in special education, lack of individualized support, systemic challenges, things like funding shortages, teacher training gaps, administrative red tape. And to your point, I mean, literally yesterday, half of the Department of Education was fired. So talk about that getting worse. I mean, it's just unreal. So it's a worthwhile read, and we'll provide links for it. But she references it in the book, so I wanted to call it out here.
Yeah. So that brings us, I think this is the last section, but I could be wrong. There might be one more. It's on page 55. It's called No Clear Path. And pretty early in the introduction, there's this quote. It says, no matter how much I planned, managed, and gripped everything around me tightly in an attempt to control the outcome, there were no guarantees. Anything could happen. I couldn't predict the future any more than I could ensure a happily ever after. And I just think this is pretty common. I see it in people in my circle, this when you don't have control over all of the things, trying to hold it tighter, trying to control it more because that might somehow help. And you don't have that ability. There are so many things outside of your control. And this level of letting go is really hard for a lot of people. And I think that becomes especially challenging if you're in this kind of parenting journey.
We had a guest on last season, Danielle. It was an episode where we talked about resparking the joy of learning. And Danielle pulled her two kids out of school. Her oldest, in particular, was a traumatized zombie of a human. By the time she pulled him out of school, he had dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and the school system had done a real number on her kid. And she used the phrase holding things loosely so many times during that episode. And I literally hear her voice so often. I just never heard it put that way. And she's very gentle in her approach and the way she said it. And I hear it in my head all the time. So if you're struggling with that, go listen to that episode. It was about resparking joy because I loved her advice. She was great. Okay, we talked at the beginning of the episode about statistics and how we have some that might blow your mind. Whew. So we did a whole episode last year about why neurotypical folks need to do a better job of understanding neurodivergent people. It's full of statistics, but one that's in this book in particular talks about the fact that approximately 80% of grown-ups with Asperger's and high functioning autism do not have full-time jobs. Not because they can't work, but because they often have difficulty being socially acceptable while they get the work done. And we've talked about last week or the week before, we talked about Asperger's and high functioning autism being terms that have kind of Asperger's for sure being out, except for people who choose to identify themselves that way, but it is no longer a medical diagnosis. And high functioning autism is also kind of waning as a term that's used, but the point remains the same, that a lot of times this becomes challenging. And so that I thought was a great call out here. And to my knowledge, Steve Jobs never shared a diagnosis about himself, but there's a story that I love. He got fired. He used to work at Atari back in the day, joystick, Frogger, and at first he was put on night shift to kind of minimize his interaction with other humans, and then finally just fired because he wouldn't shower and he'd walk around barefoot in the office, and he was just socially on a different wavelength than everyone else. And so I've never met Steve Jobs. It's not my place to diagnose him, but there's probably some wiring going on in there, right? There's probably something going on. Now we recorded that episode last year. Since then, I had come across some other studies, statistics, since we recorded that episode. And again, we'll link some stuff in the notes here and we'll put it in our Facebook group. But I had come across some really interesting studies that were conducted in the UK that showed how many people who were incarcerated in the UK were diagnosed with ADHD. So it says an estimated 25% of prisoners have ADHD. This is a 5 to 10-fold prevalence increase compared to the general population rate. However, ADHD remains critically underdiagnosed in prisons, so that number is actually probably higher. Research suggests that 1 in 4 prisoners in Britain are believed to have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Evidence shows that ADHD is linked to an increase in early age criminality and an increased likelihood of reoffending. And I thought it does make sense. There's impulse control and things like that that are linked with ADHD. And that is some scary freaking shit when you are parenting ADHD kids. And I think ADHD boys more so. And on top of that, as I'm as white as a sheet of paper, but I am parenting a brown child, male, ADHD. And that is a profiling disaster waiting to happen. Oof, crap that kid. So those numbers blew my mind for sure when I read them. It scared me. I'll say that much.
Yeah. Statistics are hard that way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Obviously, they are based in truth. And then what does that mean? And what does it mean in the dumpster fire of a society that we're living in? All right. Well, I'm not positive that this is really going to lighten the mood, but I liked the fact that this chapter wrapped up with this paragraph. So I'm going to go ahead and read the last paragraph of the chapter. As parents of neurodiverse children, we spend much of our life pushing through these daily struggles, often on the outside looking in when it comes to parenting and securing what we need to set up our children for success. But this reality isn't circumstantial, accidental, or a case of bad luck. Rather, the challenges are pretty much guaranteed and exacerbated by an entrenched system and set of norms that weren't designed with our children in mind. Our daily challenges may discourage and exhaust us, but the system is what's keeping us stuck.
I highlighted that quote too. I was like, uh-huh. And I think
Yeah.
that's why you see such a rise in homeschooling for neurodivergent families too, because if you can break out of that system, it doesn't fix everything. It doesn't make it all easy, but I think it certainly helps a bit, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that on so many levels, right? I used to always think if I can have just a couple of more years with my kid before he goes into a public school, if I get just a little bit more time with him to make sure that he's really self-confident and that he's really strong in his personal values and who he is and where he stands on things, then I've got a better chance of him standing up against all of the crap he's going to experience in public school. And that's how I was approaching it. And circumstances, primarily the pandemic, right, meant that he was home with me for a lot longer than I thought. And then on this journey, for a lot of reasons, we decided that the best choice was to just stay home and find other ways to interact in the community.
Now you're a lifer.
I am. But, it's that thing. How sad is it that we're trying to prepare our kids to be able to stand up against this wave of crap that's going to come at them in public school? And just think, if you can have your kids with you and not having to stand up against that wave, but continually growing and becoming confident in who they are and their core values and the fact that their uniqueness and all of the ways they march to a different beat are actually wonderful, amazing things that are going to make them incredibly interesting, happy, and successful in whatever way you define success. They're going to grow up to be interesting, the kind of people that are like, I want to hear your story. Like, that's an amazing life story. Well, that wraps up chapter 3. Chapter 4 is going to be what's keeping us stuck. So we'll see. Maybe that one I'll get to end on it with a happy quote.
Is it promising?
Not. All right. So we are winding down for the week. But before we go, we wanted to let you know that we have a new store on Teachers Pay Teachers. If your ears perked up at the mention of unit studies earlier, but you weren't feeling the urge to join our Patreon, you can buy them a la carte at Teachers Pay Teachers. Okay, so it's one of those things. We want to encourage people to follow along and join us and stay with us. And so if you want to do Patreon, you can get the unit studies for $7 a month. You get the unit study. But if there's one or two specific ones, maybe you're studying World War II and you really want the unit study on Japanese internment camps, you can go on Teachers Pay Teachers, and for $10, it's yours. You get that one single unit study. Go for it. We'll link the shop in our show notes. Like always, we try to make sure we always put anything we talk about in the show notes. We super, super, super appreciate your support. Meagan kind of mentioned it before. I think most people don't fully realize how much a podcast costs to run each month and how little you make podcasting. So in January, we made $4.52 profit. It was pretty amazing. But yeah, so we just really appreciate your support. And we're going to continue to keep trying to grow this community and support other homeschoolers, those progressive, like-minded homeschoolers who are just really desperate for support and community right now. And we appreciate your support, Beth.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the Japanese internment one. We took a break mid-episode because I had to make a phone call, truth be told, and noticed on President Trump is expected to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, a wartime law that allows the president to detain or deport natives and citizens of an enemy nation in order to carry out mass deportations, according to 2 officials close with the matter. And the last time that happened was Japanese internment during World War II. So if we do not learn history, either way, it's going to repeat itself. But at least if we've learned the history, we're a little bit better armed and prepared. So grab that Japanese internment one. Holy crap, you need it right now.
All right. Well, that wraps us up for today. Please make sure you tune in next week as we slowly plod our way through this incredible book that is absolutely worth our time and all of the related discussion. It almost feels like it's just a long series of actual neurodivergent podcast episodes. There's so much that we have to talk about and cover. So it's been great. We're happy to keep doing it. We hope you are enjoying it. We love your feedback. So please drop any thoughts or questions or comments. You can put them wherever you're listening. You can find us on social media. Truly, we love hearing from other people and what they're thinking. We talked a lot today about breaking the isolation around raising differently wired kids. So reach out. We're here. Yeah.
Yes,
And until
we are.
next time, happy homeschooling.
Have an awesome day.